Hey guys, welcome back to the show David Talks About Things, where each week we take a look at a modern issue and talk about its origin and history. This week we're going to be taking a look at the debate between listening and spoken language and sign language and the imbalance of funding in deaf education today. As always, I had to include a disclaimer though. While I usually try to present the information on the show impartially, the issue today is somewhat close to me as I have a deaf younger brother. I'll try my best to present everything in a non-biased manner, but I can't help to be somewhat biased. Additionally, people seem to get very heated about this debate because people can feel very strongly about these opinions as they're rather close to home. So I apologize in advance if this video offends anybody. In any case, let's get on with the show. Imagine you're in the hospital and your newborn child has just been diagnosed as profoundly deaf. Let's assume you're in the 95% of parents in this situation and are not deaf. Don't you think you should have the right to choose between teaching your child to listen and speak or to communicate via sign language? Most would say yes. However, due to the disproportionate distribution of funding by state governments to deaf education programs, the options are not exactly equal. To see why this is the case today, we have to jump almost 200 years back in history to the mid-19th century. In some form or another, the debate between oral and manual communication for the deaf has existed since at least the 1850s, back when Alexander Graham Bell championed oralism and Edward Gallaudet championed sign language. This debate continued on into the 1920s as people argued over what would be the best method for educating deaf children, oralism or manualism. Oralism is the system of teaching deaf people to communicate by the use of speech and lip reading rather than sign language. On the other hand, manualism is a method of education of deaf students using sign language. The oralists believe that deaf children ought to learn to lip read and to speak. The positives of this would be that through lip reading they would be able to communicate with the majority of the population, but it would be much more difficult for them to learn to lip read and speak because they can't actually hear. Therefore, they wouldn't be able to communicate on a very high level. The manualists believe that deaf children ought to be taught sign language. The positives of this would be that through sign language they'd be able to communicate at a much higher level because it's a lot easier for them to learn to sign rather than to lip read. The downsides of this would be that to communicate with the majority of people they would require an interpreter, making it very difficult for them to function independently in society. Over the course of the following decade, manualism and sign language would come out on top, as it was found to be the most effective method of communication for the deaf at the time. Thus, many state-funded programs and schools would come to teach only in sign language. Two important transformations occurred over the next 70 years that would convince masses of hearing-impaired people to use hearing aids. These were advancing technology and decreasing stigmatization. Following World War II, the first truly portable hearing aids began to come onto the market as a result of the many technological advances made during the war. During World War II, the development of smaller vacuum tubes allowed for the creation of vacuum tube-based hearing aids to replace the carbon hearing aids popular in the 1930s. Carbon hearing aids were large and cumbersome, some of which weighing about 7 pounds. While still rather large by today's standards, vacuum tube-based hearing aids were slightly more portable. The improvements of vacuum tube hearing aids over carbon hearing aids mattered little to the majority of the hearing-impaired population of the time, who were more concerned with their concealability. This is a result of the rampant self-stigmatization of the hearing-impaired at the time, a holdover from the eugenics movements of the late 1800s. Thus, many people who could have benefited greatly from a hearing aid were kept from it by self-stigmatization. Around 1950, a new technology revolutionized hearing aids, the transistor. This technology allowed for much smaller and much more easily concealed hearing aids to be developed. Popular methods of concealing hearing aids at the time included tie clips for men and jewelry for women. Through changing technology, more hearing-impaired people chose to use a hearing aid, and thus self-stigmatization declined over the following 30 to 40 years. In 1977, technology for directly stimulating the cochlea, the first multi-channel cochlear implant, was developed. This device made assistive technology possible for the profoundly deaf who could not be helped by hearing aids. This technology involves a surgical procedure for implanting a receiver underneath the skin and an electrode embedded in the cochlea capable of stimulating the cochlear nerve. After surgical healing, these components are paired with an external hearing device containing microphones, a processor, and a battery. Following cochlear implementation, the recipient learns to interpret the electrical impulses associated with sounds, syllables, and speech. While surgery can be done on adults, it is more often done on infants soon after deafness is diagnosed. Through infantile hearing screenings, advanced technology, and decreased stigmatization, the oralism versus manualism debate of the 1920s has changed greatly. Setbacks of hindered communicative abilities and difficult education of early oralism are remedied by modern hearing aids and cochlear implants, which can provide almost perfect hearing with few gaps. So let's go back to you, standing in the hospital, holding your newborn deaf child, wondering what you're going to do.
When children are born with hearing loss, their parents have a choice of how they want their child to communicate. It's very important for parents to be educated on what their communication options are for their children. Parents get to choose if they want their child to learn American Sign Language or if they'd like for their child to learn to listen and speak.
If you live in Tennessee, like I do, then you have two options. You can either enroll your child in any of the 3 campuses across the state of Tennessee Schools for the Deaf, where they'll learn sign language and you won't pay a thing. Or you can drive your child to Memphis, where they'll learn listening and spoken language, and you'll have to shell out $50,000 a year, 8% more than the average annual household income in Tennessee. They do offer financial aid, but it's not going to be free. Now, this data is only for Tennessee, but the same pattern holds true across the country. Without state funding, LSL programs are left to either charge tuition or beg for donations. These states only fund programs that teach children sign language, a holdover from the ancient fight against oralism back in the early 20th century. The purpose of government funding and policy regarding disabled people is not to force them down one path, but to make options available to them, to create a level playing field. But this isn't happening. Deaf people or their parents should be able to choose how they're going to live their lives and how they're going to communicate with others. With assistive technology only improving, more and more of those 95% of parents who aren't deaf are going to want their child to grow up speaking the language of their family. But legislation isn't changing, and $50,000 isn't getting any cheaper. And state governments are consistently failing to provide a level playing field for LSL programs. That doesn't really sound fair, does it? Let me know what you guys think in the comments, and thank you for tuning in for this week's episode of David Talks About Things. I'll see y'all next week.